Hi, this is Paul, and I interrupt my Joe Rogan interview for the Sam Harris one. First reading of this, kind of a frustrated talk. I found more in the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris talks from a few years ago as time went on. Maybe that will be the same here. I don't know. I get very frustrated listening to Sam because he doesn't seem to understand his own arguments. Maybe I don't understand his arguments. That could be. But let's jump in. And it starts almost right away when they get into is and ought.
Yeah, but you're in very good company. Most people in science and philosophy, as you know, believe there really is a disjunction between is and ought. And to follow Hume's really cast aside remarks, I mean, he didn't go into it deeply, but at one point he wrote that you can't derive an ought from an is, right? There's no description of the way the world is that can tell you how it ought to be. So, and he was decrying the fact that so many scholars and in general so many theologians in his time would move smoothly from is to ought without acknowledging that they had committed a logical error. But I do think there's a trick of language lurking at the bottom of this is and ought talk that is misleading. And
He doesn't really get into, okay, exactly which way, but what he's about to do. Now, I tweeted a whole bunch of little clips out today because I've been, again, working on refining my reaping skills. And so then I wind up with all these little video things that I can nicely put on Twitter and have just a few little comments on them. And that's been fun lately. But here comes one of the big ones.
And it's difficult to spot. And, I believe I've spotted it. But I the people who don't agree with me don't agree with me. I mean, their intuitions don't pass through, the point where I'm trying to shove them.
That was an interesting way of saying that.
And, it's somewhat analogous to, the philosopher Wittgenstein made a point when he was criticizing Freud. He was criticizing Freud's notion of the unconscious. He thought this reification of the unconscious was fallacious. And, we can leave that aside. I'm not sure I agree with him there, but the point he was making about the power of language was interesting. He said, imagine if instead of saying, I saw nobody in the room, we said, I saw Mr. Nobody in the room. Imagine a language that forced us to say, I saw Mr. Nobody, right? Just imagine what confusion would be born of that convention of language. That's something.
Okay, now pay attention to that, because imagine the confusion if the language forced you to say Mr. Nobody instead of nobody, because obviously nobody is sort of like null, and that's going to be important as we get into this. Mr. Nobody now instantiates a null, and on the last Thief in the Night conversation I did, we had a big conversation about the discovery of zero. And one might argue that, well, perhaps zero is a similar thing. Well, maybe not.
He said in his, I think it was in the Blue Book. And there are many places in our thinking about the world where language plays a similarly confusing role, where we have reified something which is not
probably happens with free will.
Yeah, no. So I think it's confused us about free will. It's confused us about death, for instance. I mean, I think, well, if you're an atheist who doesn't believe that anything happens after you die, right? If you think there's no rebirth, there's no reincarnation, and that Eastern picture of karma and rebirth is probably not true, and you think there's no heaven or hell. I mean, if you really think you get something like a dial tone when you die, well, many people are left expecting some kind of oblivion, some kind of positive nothingness, some permanent loss of experience. And so this notion of oblivion is a kind of reification. But if you think about it more clearly,
okay, now we got to pay attention to this, because this is a valid point, and others have made this point. But one of the things that I thought of recently when I was watching that's kind of a funny. The stills often get funny facial things. Sometimes when I find them, I put them on my thumbnails like I did for my Sunday thing. But this point about null goes both ways. And I'll often hear people like Sam Harris make the point going forward. Now, don't forget the Wittgenstein thing, because that's going to be important a little bit later on, because he completely forgets his point, and he basically does exactly what Wittgenstein is complaining about. But he's going to do that a little bit later, but I want to first stop and hit this point. Okay, now, this is a section that a bunch of you wanted me to comment on back with his conversation with the Words on Fire guys, because this is an important point. Because when we talk about the first personal, which is, and actually Sam will use these terms a little bit later in the conversation, the first personal, which is sort of us first, and the third personal is derivative, because we sort of have to imaginatively transcend ourselves. You'll hear Sam Harris talk about self-transcendence a lot in that conversation too. You have to sort of transcend yourself and try to imaginatively look down from the third personal. But again, are you really transcending yourself? Because you're still imagining you are looking down to the third personal. So then we have all this question about, well, what about before us? And you have basically this implicit observer, which is what Jordan Peterson is going to say. So again, remember where we started back with Wittgenstein, and then Sam Harris making the point about null in terms of afterlife. Okay, now this little bit.
Dr. Kazar, you got some comments about that?
I did. I wanted to circle back to, you said, if I heard you correctly, that reality doesn't exist without consciousness. And I think that's true if God exists. But then if God doesn't exist, then it's not true. So human beings, of course, haven't been on planet Earth since the beginning of the universe. The universe is about 13.8 billion years old. So say 12 billion years ago, there were no human beings at all. And presumably there was no consciousness at all. So there was reality. There were the beginning of stars and things like that, but there was no conscious beings anywhere that was able to understand that, unless God exists. Now, if God exists, and if it's true that God is the Logos, well, then you would say from all eternity, there was consciousness, there was a mind, there was a divine mind. And so, and on that view, there actually would be an ultimate unity, you might say, in terms of the divine essence and the divine mind ultimately being one. So consciousness and existence have this fundamental ground in God. But if God doesn't exist, then I think what you said would not be true, because again, 12 billion years ago, there's no human beings around, presumably unless they're aliens, there's no one around to be conscious. And so there would have been reality.
Got the aliens in there.
Say 12 billion years ago, but there wouldn't have been consciousness.
Yeah, so I want to go out on a limb here too, because I have a problem with that. I can't shake the supposition that our scientific cosmological theories have an implicit conscious observer nested inside of them, even when they claim not to.
That's a really good point. Because again, I mean, we sort of switch out to the third personal and are imagining all of this stuff going on in creation. I mean, you have the same problem in many ways in terms of when I listen to people debate Genesis. Well, what would the video camera see? Well, it depends on where the video camera would be. And a video camera then, where would it be charged? I mean, we're playing all these imaginative games when all this stuff sort of floods in. Now, narrative does that automatically, but we very quickly forget the perspective. And again, this is one of the key points that Peugeot keeps making, is that, well, it depends on where you're standing and who's looking, because this seeing isn't as modernism imagined it would be, sort of just a bringing in, as if our eyes didn't have locale somewhere in terms of time and space.
So, for example, when you talk about 13 billion years ago, there's I don't know how to say this properly.
C.S. Lewis talked about this a bit in his book Miracles, because when you say, well, how far away is the sun? Well, 93 million miles. What does that number mean? Well, if I run a mile, or if I jog 5 kilometers, or if I drive 600 some miles down to LA, or if in other words, we take these things and we imaginatively transfer them into, so we're doing all this mechanism back and forth between the first personal and the third personal. And I mean, Peterson's point here is, well, what about that?
The concept of 13 billion years seems to me to require a conscious observer to formulate to begin with, because I don't understand what duration consists of in the absence of something experiencing duration. It's like, how does something last 13 billion years? Like, in some sense, it all happens at once if there's no conscious observer. Like, there's...
And I thought that was an excellent point. Okay, so bear that in mind as we go back to Sam Harris.
Clearly, that's precisely the kind of thing you would not. I mean, if it's simply the end of experience, well, then you're not going to be experiencing the end of experience, right? This is not, you didn't experience an absence before you were born.
Right. Well, the idea that you would experience is implicit in the way the question is framed.
Right.
Right.
So there's nothing you're going to suffer. I mean, this is something that Epicurus pointed out through Lucretius, that, death is nothing for us. Where we are, death is not, and where death is, we are not, right? Like there's just non-overlapping sets of facts, whatever those facts are.
Okay, so fine, we get your point about null and all this, but does that mean Sam Harris won't worry? Sam Harris has all sorts of worries. They just come up in a different place.
Seeding every other ordinary moment in life with this capacity to refresh the mind and an allowance,
revivify the stale dogma of men.
Just it is the thing that equips us to actually be loving and unconflicted and relaxed in the.
Okay. So let me get a little bit earlier here.
We're going to derive our sacred values from this strata of experience that you described. But there's also an element, there's also the fact that we derive our values from collective agreement, right? Yes. So and maybe we feed the collective agreement with the sacred experience. But then if we lose that collective tradition, it's very difficult to rebuild that from first principles.
Yeah, 100%. And I would say,
well, we're going to have to go back and look at something where he contradicts himself right there too, because before we got the very flat definition of truth, but now we're going to get his usual critique against religion,
or even the deepest insights you can have through meditation or psychedelics is sufficient for everything for us to get everything we want out of life, right? It's like I think its proper use is, as you describe, is seeding.
This is what happens when I don't prepare. I was close.
And easier interpretations that require less hermeneutics, less cognitive bandwidth, less principles of charity, and less cosmopolitanism, and so therefore it's no accident that you wind up with something like the Islamic State if you take the Quran very, very seriously. And that's what worries me as we live in this world where it's increasingly easy for small numbers of people to screw up the whole project for millions of us, as technology.
We're getting awfully imaginative here. This project for millions of us. And we're going to be into the future. Sam, you're in your 50s, not going to live forever.
Leverages the consequence of
yes, well, that's why
tribalism.
I've been focusing on development of the individual, because it is increasingly possible for individuals to do that. So we have to stop doing it.
Yes. So, I'm with you there.
Look,
all right.
Death is the end of experience. So, which is to say, there's nothing to worry about, really, if death is just the end of anything.
So there's nothing to worry about in the past, nothing to worry about in the future.
And so how do you think that relates to the is-ought problem?
Yeah, so to come back to is and ought, I just think really what we have, I mean, forget about morality, forget about questions of good and evil, forget about any value judgment. And try to return your mind to something like the primal circumstance of consciousness, right? I mean, just imagine waking up from, a 100-year sleep, and you've forgotten everything about yourself, and now you're just a mind in a world. In some sense, we're all potentially in that position in every moment in our lives, just seeing creation afresh, right? Seeing this moment of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking for, as though for the first time, clearly.
Yeah, do you know that, have you ever...
Another bizarre idea, as if every time we wake up, we haven't had not only our formation, remember all the things we talked about with, I'll just pull up the stuff we talked about with respect to Joe Rogan and the coding. The religious spirit of your ancestors codes your relevance realization software. In other words, when you wake up, it's just this, we're just going to self-transcend. Every time we wake up, it's a tabula rasa. It's a clean slate. There's no programming here. We just see the world as it is. No, we don't see the world as it is. And Peterson has a really nice riff coming up about that. All of this programming has been put into you by your parents, by their DNA, by their culture, their individuation, and then the connection that you are between them. 23, and then their parents, and on and on and on, and this great chain. But no, we wake up every morning. It's a brand new world. Don't, when you wake up, say to whoever you're living with sometimes, how did you sleep? Why? Because how well they slept makes a great deal of difference in terms of the world that they're seeing right now. Had a bad night's sleep, slept poorly, or maybe, in the case of my wife, you snored all night. I didn't sleep well. Not quite the tabula rasa then.
Heard of the neurological case? I think it was a man who had bilateral hippocampal damage, and he was in the psychiatric hospital, and he woke up like that every second. His wife would come in the room, and he'd say, it's as if I'm seeing you for the first time. He lost that. Right. He lost the imposition of memory on his perception, and so every perception was fresh and new.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not recommending brain damage to anyone as a way of freshening up experience, but there's a non-neurologically compromised way of.
I think you're trying to say, as if I'm brain damaged.
Grasping this intuition, which is just in this moment, experience really is potentially totally fresh and totally new, and but for the fact there's this ever-present layer of our thinking about it, our remembering what just happened, our expecting the next thing that's going to happen. It's really
now again, we're sort of back in this world of objects, and Peterson is about to really take a club to this idea, but nothing seems to faze this fella.
Conversation we're having with ourselves in each moment, and meditation is a way of breaking that spell and actually being vividly aware of the present moment in a way that frees you from this automaticity of viewing everything through your concepts and your discursiveness.
Okay. So is that the great way of being? Is that the way we should be? Maybe we should, I before said, well, take cocaine and a bullet chaser. Well, maybe it's meditation and a bullet chaser. So is the good that we imagine sitting there and meditating while the lion leaps out of the jungle and eats you? Is that the good? Because for the most part, you sit there and meditation almost presumes an entire context around you. I'm going to meditate while I'm driving down the freeway. Use the force, Luke. Again, he just devoid it from context, and there you're standing with Neo and Morpheus in a black screen and guns, lots of guns.
Neurologically justifiable viewpoint too, because it looks like the hippocampal map that more or less keeps track of, in some sense, our memories, and then also of our conditional positioning in the world is likely either it's inhibiting that more primal perception, although it's doing it in a very useful manner.
And just that, okay, so Sam wants to argue that this blankness is a primal perception. What do you mean by primal in that sentence? What you mean is it's primal to your monarchical vision. Is it primal to this imagined going back through evolutionary time? You know, what are you, an amoeba in water? Is that the primal state that you're considering? Why is that primal? It's only primal if you first swallow a monarchical vision where there's nothing, and then I'm going to hover above and let there be objects.
Generally speaking, because it keeps us oriented enough in the moment so that we focus on the minute details that might be necessary to our survival. But it's conceivable that it's simultaneously blinding us to a broader and deeper reality that in some sense is deeply nourishing in the face of suffering.
Yeah. And what's more,
that's a pretty big thing Peterson said. He basically laid out his gyroscopic meaning is the key to dealing with suffering. Now, suffering is a big thing behind this because basically when you look at Sam Harris and his worldview, it's all about there not being suffering, as if suffering is the greatest evil. Is suffering the greatest evil? I don't know. Do joggers suffer? Do joggers suffer voluntarily? Do weightlifters suffer voluntarily? Do students suffer voluntarily? That's simply taking as a given, which I don't think is a given at all.
The mechanism that is tiling over reality with concepts in every moment and keeping us thinking.
Again, reality is this blank slate. Where? Show me reality. Is it space? Is space a blank slate? Where's this blank slate reality? It's just simply bringing it in, sneaking it in, sort of like this implicit observer through 13 billion years.
And perseverating about our experience rather than recognizing that we're identical to our experience. Let's table this part of the discussion for a second. I mean, this would go under the question of what is the self? What do we mean by self, and what might self-transcendence be? But this whole mechanism is productive of most, if not all, of our psychological suffering, right? Like there's just, all of our anxiety and depression and fear and regret and shame and
So if I could only live in that white, clean space of the Matrix, I want to get back to the Matrix. Rebel Wisdom had an excellent conversation with Damian Walker and Jonathan Peugeot, where they touched on the Matrix. That gets back into the hero's journey stuff. So I want to get all back to that. Because, here it's just like, well, primacy it's as if we're living in a sensory deprivation tank.
An inability to love even the people we ostensibly love, in our lives. The contraction into self that is so toxic so much of the time. All of our deferring our happiness to some future time where we've met all of these goals that raise our status in comparison with everyone else.
It's a very interesting section in here because, it's deferring our suffering. Oh, okay, well, let's eliminate delayed gratification. Something I should really make a clip of, all the way back to Jordan Peterson's his 5 points on the resurrection that he filmed. It was right after my conversation with him in April of 2018, where he talked about sacrifice as the invention of the future. Because again, if we're living in this kind of empty white space, and there's a past, we're not going to deny that because we have all of our evolutionary psychology we want to shovel in. The future, that's very selectively either taken in and out. Now suddenly, why are we see, now he didn't say religion here, but this is one of his big knocks on religion. Well, religion encourages people to delay gratification in order to achieve some heavenly goal. Oh, okay. What about delaying gratification in order not to gain 50 pounds? The future is not promised to me. Why don't eat, drink, and be merry? I mean, the reason he looks at Epicurus is because basically what he's got here is sort of a version of Epicureanism. It's, well, why delay gratification? Well, he's gonna, want to delay gratification. I mean, he does not weigh in 350 pounds. I assume he's faithful to his wife and he's a good father to his daughters. Praise God for that. But again, this stuff, I haven't thought about Sam Harris for a while. I do have a little Muppet coming for him. But I watched him and it was just like, oh, gosh, man. But don't forget Wittgenstein. We're coming up to that.
We're comparing ourselves to. That whole stratum of being a person is a confection of endlessly thinking about ourselves, about our past and our future, and even our present.
Okay, so the problem with people is, well, we're thinking about our past and our present and future, given the fact that you're worried about Islam, and, you get to the end of the video and it's like, well, there's Islam. It's like, well, just don't worry about Islam, Sam. No, but I'm worried about my daughters. Well, you'll be null by then, just like you were null. You didn't worry about your parents before you were born. Why should you worry about your daughters after you die? Why? Just go to that null, empty place. It's sort of existential suicide. But hey.
And it's possible to punch through that, whether it's through, using psychedelics or practicing meditation or just having
they're the two sacraments. Well, either by meditation or psychedelics. Well, yeah. Daddy, the house is on fire. No, not for me. I don't believe him.
It's a collision with the present moment that's engineered by something. Someone close to you dies, or something.
Daddy, the house is on fire. Psychedelics. What is the house? All is one. No, he's too good a father. He's too good a husband.
Something changes.
Music can do that. Music can do that, and dance can do that.
Or in certain cases, the awe you describe, looking up at the Milky Way, right? I mean that can do that for people.
Okay, so let me.
But I just didn't answer your question. This notion that there's this separation between facts and values, right? Doesn't run through when you think of what this primal circumstance is like, where you have to figure out. When you have to make sense of the world, you have to try to understand what is going on in the world, and you have to. Most importantly, you have to figure out what to do next, right?
Yes.
So I view
why. We're just in this existential sensory deprivation tank where all is one, and what to do next. Why do you have to figure out what to do next? Because if you're done, it's null. And before it was null. Why be burdened with existence at all? We have to figure out what to do next. Why? In order to achieve something? Sam, you look like you're in good shape. I don't wish you any ill. You could live to 100. Fine. But where's this all going?
You can forget about morality, forget about science, forget about anything for the moment, and just recognize that the world is such that we're confronted with an ever-present navigation problem. We have the possibility.
There are times when he repeats almost verbatim what he just said a few minutes ago. I guess that's living in that little kind of that empty matrix room.
Of navigating both personally and collectively to places in the space of all possible experience that are just manifestly terrible, and the worst place I call the worst possible misery for everyone, right? So
okay, now wait a minute. Go all the way back to Wittgenstein. Remember when I said remember Wittgenstein? Remember Wittgenstein. What did he say? In fact, I even made a clip. Back in time.
The philosopher Wittgenstein made a point when he was criticizing Freud. He was criticizing Freud's notion of the unconscious. He thought this reification of the unconscious was fallacious, and we can leave that aside. I'm not sure I agree with him there, but the point he was making about the power of language was interesting. He said, imagine if instead of saying I saw nobody in the room, we said I saw Mr. Nobody in the room. Imagine a language that forced us to say, I saw Mr. Nobody, right? Just
imagine a language that's forcing us. Well, what if we force the language to do almost the same thing?
So it is possible to imagine a universe where every conscious system suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. Some version of the perfect hell, right? And then,
does this perfect hell exist? Is it real, according to your... Or is it, where is this? Well, have we made is hell Sam Harris's Mr. Nobody?
And then it's possible to recognize that whatever you want to call it, whether you want to use words like good and evil or right and wrong or not, every other place on what I call the moral landscape is better than the worst possible misery for everyone.
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
Harris is at points a weird kind of idealist, because imagine, well, you just scolded us about Wittgenstein and being careful about these nulls, but imagine Mr. Nobody hell, and then there's you, and you're not in it. So congratulations, it could be worse. And of course, one of Peterson's things is, yeah, it could always be worse, but it's sort of like telling the prisoner, well, you're a prisoner and you're living on rations and there's rats in your cells, but hey, it could be worse. I could be branding you with hot irons every moment. So cheer up.
I agree with that completely. That's why I studied atrocity for so long, because I figured if I could find out what the worst thing was, that would be a pointer to the best thing, because if you know the worst thing, then the opposite of that is the best thing, whatever that is. Sure. That doesn't mean you have to propositionalize it. It's not even that easy to do.
But now remember, Sam's project here is to get objective knowledge of values into the world. So we're going to play Mr. Nobody, and we're going to say that there's a hell. And so now, via Mr. Nobody, we have objective hell. And it's like, what point were you making with Wittgenstein?
And there may be many opposites of that. It may not just be one best possible place on the landscape. There could be many peaks and valleys.
But there's one worst possible place, too, in his moral landscape. Is it a moral landscape or a landscape of pleasure?
On the moral landscape. And there could be peaks that are not equivalent in anything but the fact that they are equally distant from the worst possible misery for everyone, right? So
okay, so he's using this metaphor, which again, I mean, he's just warned us about all of this stuff, but he's using this metaphor that there's this whole, and why is he calling it a moral landscape? Well, because what morality does is orient you, again, it's sort of a rehashed Epicurean. Morality is warning you in terms of how to seek the pleasure and how to avoid the pain. Is that the game we're playing here? Is that what morality is for? Especially because before I'm born, it's null, and after I die, it's null. So the only thing in between that matters is pleasure and pain? I don't think he believes that. I doubt he lives that way.
Could be, so I'm not, this can sound like moral relativism, but it's not. It's an objective picture of morality.
I don't think it does.
But it's just to say that.
So then, is morality just a function of how to get goodness, meaning pleasure, and how to avoid suffering?
Or there may be very different ways of living where, given the right kind of minds involved, you could be happy in very strange ways. And
okay, then we're just kind of back here to this. Well, so it's incidental, but I thought morality was a function of pleasure or pain. The whole point of positing the most horrible hell was to somehow objectify it, which again is completely contra his point with respect to Wittgenstein. But okay, so we're going to somehow wed is and ought by objectifying suffering, the greatest possible suffering, and therefore we will have our ought as ought is seeking pleasure or the absence of pain. You see, and this is where, of course, it's funny because Peterson, it's all about meaning. And meaning for Peterson is sort of the navigation of how to work through the world. So this is where, in many ways, Harris is sort of a hedonist, and Peterson is all about meaning, because for Peterson, you follow meaning. For Harris, morality is a function of avoiding suffering or pursuing, he'll want to say well-being because it's a little bit better than pleasure, but a lot of well-being has suffering mixed into it. In fact, both his psychedelics, both of his path, the psychedelics and the meditation, neither of which is terribly moral in that sense, in terms of a navigational system, both of them involve suffering. Why doesn't everyone just have this huge amount of ability to do meditation well? Because in order for them to follow your little app or to go to the meditation center, you have to suffer in order to achieve. How about the psychedelic? Are there no suffering with respect to psychedelics? I've never had any, but when I hear about the ayahuasca, I hear a lot of vomiting. So, again, every time I listen to his stuff, I just think it's just completely disconnected from itself.
And in ways that, would be counterintuitive for, apes like ourselves.
Now we're apes.
But nonetheless, they could be very far from the...
Well, at least apes think not about before they were born, and they think not about after they're born. We don't find chimps and orangutans and gorillas sitting there and being concerned about global climate change. They're just eating and reproducing. Is this the good life we have? I don't find them meditating either. All they do seem to worry about is probably all of that stuff he talks about in terms of the normal mind of, well, where am I going to get my next meal? Well, let's do some grooming. Well, let's do some procreating. And back to Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, which Peterson knows, and it's part of the reason, it's part of the thing beneath Peterson's project of meaning, is that meaning is a better navigator than whatever this crazy system Sam seems to be pushing us towards.
The worst possible misery for everyone. So in any case, I call this, so whatever you want to call navigating in this space, moving away from just unendurable, pointless misery, right, toward, beauty and creativity and joy and love and, all of the good stuff we recognize. And again, we haven't seen the horizon of this. We have no idea how beautiful life could be for.
But that's his navigation system. And that's where he differs from Peterson. Because again, for Peterson, Peterson's navigation system is meaning. This is Sam Harris's navigation system.
For minds like our own, or minds, significantly more sensitive and creative and intelligent than our own. There's no
had
reason.
a vision of heaven as a place that was perfect, where everyone that was in it was striving to make it better.
Right. Yeah. So there's some.
Sam, do you listen? Do you know how to have a conversation? Peterson just said something really pretty profound that you might want to engage with, but no, I basically have all of my little talks. They're kind of in a string. It's really kind of in a tree. Depending on what Jordan says, I'll say this, and then I'll say that. Did you hear what he just said? Do you know how to have a conversation?
There's no
had
reason.
a vision of heaven as a place that was perfect, where everyone that was in it was striving to make it better.
Right, right. Yeah, so there's some
Pay no attention to the vision of heaven where everyone was striving to make it better. Why have Jordan in the call at all?
we don't know how good things can get, and we don't know how bad things can get, but we know they can get.
Well, except that your orientation is the worst possible thing. It's sort of like an inverted ontological argument is the basis of his argument about morality.
Quite terrible from where our current vantage point, and we know they can get quite wonderful from our current vantage point. And
we can, and this is again a point of Peterson's, we know that things can get worse. Well, that's pretty easy to imagine. Do we really know they can get better? Because they've been worse. Well, only if we imagine that we have an implicit observer over into bad times before our lives. But do we really know how much better they can get? We sort of imagine it, but now we're sort of on the ontological argument on the other side.
This is where the distance between facts and values collapses for me. There are right.
So let me ask you a question.
Let me just land this final sentence.
Yep.
This is where facts and values land. Well, I think he's sort of shown it that values, well, there is one value. It's making things better. And there's another, and the other's making things worse. Now, what Peterson's going to dog him on again and again and again, but just like the comment he makes about heaven, Sam doesn't listen. And this was true of, now I'm remembering all my frustration from listening to them go 4 nights. So for them to talk again, yeah, I'll listen again and I'll probably do this again. But gosh, it's frustrating because Sam doesn't listen. Sam doesn't listen. Because, oh, what about, nope. Well, Sam, what is better? Well, better is less suffering. Well, then surely not bothering to meditate is better than meditating. Not bothering to do ayahuasca and vomit in a bucket is better than not doing the psychedelic. No, but you have to go down the hill in order to go. Oh. Well, how do we know?
There are right and wrong answers with respect to how to navigate in this space. Right, there is, and they're right and wrong whether we've discovered them or not. Right, we could all be wrong about the thing we should do next, so as to be as happy as possible. You know, we could think we're doing something very wise and compassionate and useful, and actually we're, slowly poisoning ourselves with some, toxin that we haven't identified. Right, and so there are things. So it is truly possible to not know what you don't know. It's truly possible to not know what you're missing, right? For there to be some happier place on the landscape that you could get to if only you knew to try to get to it. But you're not trying to get to it because you're satisfied, drinking 12 beers a night and, cheating on your wife or whatever it is.
So how good is your compass then? And I would, again, just at that point, say that Peterson's compass is better. Because drinking 12 beers a night and cheating on your wife winds up being not terribly meaningful. I've never done it, but I can imagine it's pleasurable. I don't drink. Drinking sort of makes you numb. Some it makes you bold. Some it makes you sad. Some it makes you happy. Novel sexual experience with a new partner. Well, it's scientifically we can say, well, that certainly seems to attract and excite males. So, what you're saying is that maybe being committed to your partner, which certainly sounds like self-denial, which he just previously talked about, that's better. Why? Well, because there's a better outcome with self-denial. Well, then your whole navigational program of avoiding suffering and pursuing pleasure doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. You could have a whole civilization that is unaware of just...
That's a local peak.
Yeah,
but not
exactly.
A great one.
It's a local peak, but yes, not as good as it might be. So there are there are two ways to see that this, in my view, that this disconnection between facts and values collapses. First, you need to value certain things in order to get any facts in hand in the first place. I mean, any statement about facts relies on having first.
And now he sounds like a presuppositionalist.
First valued things like evidence and logical coherence, right? If you don't value logic, there's no logical argument you can give someone to say that they should value it. If someone doesn't value evidence, there's no evidence you could give them to say that they should value it. Epistemology sort of bites its own tail, or picks itself up from its bootstraps.
Right. Although that actually harkens back to the is-ought problem, right? Because right there you said, and I'm not denying the validity of anything you've said so far, but right there you said that without agreeing on the validity of evidence, let's say, there's no agreement about what is. And there we've got a frame problem there, right? We have that value that you need to even determine what is. Well, The question then is, well, where does that value come from? And you can't say, well, it comes from what is in some easy manner, because you just said, unless you have a value of a certain sort, you can't derive what is. And that's partly why this ought problem just doesn't seem to go away.
Yeah, but it goes away because it goes away the moment you recognize there is in principle always a mystery at our backs. This is true experientially. I mean, I would say this is true experientially with respect to the nature of consciousness, but it's true conceptually with respect to even those fields that pretend to be most directly in contact with the nature of reality. I mean, so even physics,
Now, I'm not denying that there's a mystery at our backs, but this doesn't help his navigation, does it? Again, I listen to this man and I just think, you don't hear Jordan, maybe you don't hear yourself either.
When you're talking about the most rudimentary laws of physics, right, there has to be a first brute fact or a brute axiom that you accept that need not prove itself, right? Is it
okay? So now he's a presuppositionalist.
There's no self-justifying epistemology.
Yes, well, yes, I believe that. Well, and I think that's why there is an emphasis on faith in some principle in so many religious traditions, is that there is a starting place there, and you're trying to flesh out where that is, at least to some degree. So let me ask you a couple of things. Sure. Mention one thing and then ask you a couple more things. So this is-ought distinction is even more peculiar when you look deep into the neuroscience of perception. Okay, so one of the most influential books I ever read was An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. And it's a classic text on perception and a very sophisticated one. And I don't think it has no pretensions to mysticism of any sort. And so that's kind of interesting given the conclusion. And the conclusion of the author is that what we see aren't facts or objects. We see meanings. So, for example, a 6-month-old who crawls towards a visual cliff, which is a plate of glass stretched over.
And I remember this picture from my college psychology 101 class.
Or placed over a falling off place. The 6-month-old will stop. He won't crawl 7 months. I don't remember the exact age. He won't crawl across that piece of glass.
Right.
He doesn't see cliff and infer falling off place. He sees falling off place. And there's a condition called neglect, which is characteristic of certain people who have prefrontal lobe damage. It's not neglect, it's called utilization behavior.
Yeah.
And these people lose the ability not to act in the presence of a meaningful object. So if they walk down the hall and the door is open, they will go through the door. If you put a cup in front of them, they cannot stop but pick it up because they don't see cup and infer drinking. They see drinking object directly. And so even that is-ought distinction is deceptive in a very fundamental sense because...
Now, the point he just makes here, he makes a lot of times. We don't see objects, we see meaning. We see meaning first. And I made that point many times. We see opportunities and obstacles. Now, there's a little bit more validity for Sam. Now, he's not going to listen to this either. In fact, I don't think he listens to hardly anything. I think what does Sam Harris hear in a conversation like this? He hears opportunities for his little set speeches. I don't think he hears anything else, because this point that he's making, really, it could actually be utilized by Sam Harris. Say, okay, well, we see opportunities for pursuing pleasure and obstacles to our pleasure, or opportunities for avoiding suffering. Again, if you're going to use that metric for sort of your within secularism navigational system. But again, I think Peterson's system is better in terms of meaning. I think we much more pursue what's meaningful than we avoid suffering and seek the absence of suffering, well-being, let's say. But Sam's not going to listen to him, because this is a devastating point Peterson makes, and I'm just going to go into my little blank matrix room.
It's predicated on the idea that what we see are meaningless objects, and that we lay an overlay of meaning on top of that. And it's not by no means obvious at all that that's how we see.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why it's been so difficult to make machines that can see and act in the real world, because the object world is not simple. And that value structure that you're describing, that value structure, right? That is embedded in all of our perceptions in ways that we are only beginning to understand scientifically.
Okay, now let's pause, because I want to go to basically Jonathan Pageau making a similar point to Michaela Peterson. Now, what did Peterson just do? Peterson basically just said, okay, according to this much vaunted science, we don't see objects first. We, in fact, in some ways, infer objects and infer realities from meaning. In fact, objects themselves are, in some ways, a little bit problematic the more we're learning.
Delve into that, what that pattern is. Yeah, actually, let's just start there. So,
Sure.
I don't know if you're going to be able to describe that, but what's the pattern that you found?
And so the best way to understand it is that is the way that Jordan explains it. I think Jordan has a great way of explaining it, which is similar to mine, and it's very easy to understand it that way, which is that the world presents itself to you as too much, right? The world is full of stuff, and there's too much stuff, and everything that you perceive has an indefinite amount of detail, and that detail has,
Okay, in other words, combinatorial explosion is not simply about the number of objects in the world. Combinatorial explosion not only goes out in terms of numbers of objects, combinatorial explosion can, combinatorial explosion, well, what do you see in front of you? I see a green frog. Do you see arms? No, most of you just saw, Kermit, don't touch the mic here. Most of you just saw Kermit. And a whole well of things just came up inside of you because you were raised with this little fellow. Did you see his little eyes? No, all of that's all part of who Kermit was. Now, our little Joe Rogan chimp here, is much more of a generic chimp. You sort of recognized him as a chimp, but just kind of a chimp. But Kermit, no, all the little, this stuff around here, his arms, his legs, and if I set him here, because of the puppetry, we can cross his little legs, and but even the armor, all of this stuff, you're not seeing just objects. You're seeing whole things. And you're taking all these little parts, but the combinatorial explosiveness can get into the eyes, get into the mouth, get into the weird little hands, can get into, I gotta get over here. I'm doing all of this stuff, and I've got the screen in the way. The combinatorial explosiveness is all back in here.
It's like it's infinite detail all the way down, right? And so despite that, for some reason, we're able to perceive unities in our experience, right? I'm able to say that.
So you perceive Kermit as a unity, and it's quite a complex unity. Our little green friend is.
That's an apple, but an apple is not one thing, right? An apple is a million things. An apple is millions and millions of things, but I'm somehow able to perceive it as one thing. And so, but I'm also able to perceive parts of things and the unity of things at the same time. We kind of move between the two, right? I can look at a car and I could say, that's a car, but I could also realize, well, that's the wheel of a car. That's this part, that's the paint, that's this. So I can see parts and wholes at the same time. So the question is, first of all, how is that possible? And what does that mean? And so we have a capacity to compress reality into unities. So that happens in space, it happens with objects, but it also happens in time, right? Because time also presents itself to us as an infinite amount. Like, think about all the things that are happening around you right.
And this goes back to the 13 billion years, remember? So 13 billion years, bang. 93 million miles, bang. What is that? Can we really imagine that as duration? See, all of this is basically killing modernism. It's killing modernity, because modernity was all about the objects and the atoms and all of the simple things. And so, this is part of the reason that Sam is losing his worldview. This is what John Vervaeke talks about in terms of domicile. So maybe I should be a little bit more gentle. But Sam is very high status and he's wealthy and he's got all those things. So he doesn't matter if this little insignificant pastor in Sacramento, California, I've got my count Muppet coming for Sam. Should come today. I got a Spider-Man for Tom Holland, but I'm not entirely satisfied with it. Beaker was kind of fun. Jury's still out on Vervaeke and Peugeot, but
right now, at this moment, right, there are millions of things happening, but you somehow are able to focus your attention, and then you're also capable of stringing together elements to create a story, to create a connection between different aspects of what's going on. And so that's not arbitrary. That has a pattern. So there's a way in which we are able to recognize that certain events go together and we can recount them as going together. And like I said, it's not at all arbitrary. So once you...
And that point, he's the apostle of purpose. It's not arbitrary. That's key. It's not chaotic. It's not blank, and it's not chaos. It's not arbitrary.
You start to see it, you realize that, for example, in the Bible, in Genesis, what it's describing as it's describing the creation of the world is something like that. It's something which is helping you experience and delve into the way in which identities exist.
Okay, so he's basically saying the creation of the world, part of the issue, part of the fight with Genesis and science is we read that third personal. And we imagined, well, there's a video camera there. Well, where exactly is that video camera? How wide can it see? Well, then we draw pictures, and it's like you're forgetting the perspective of the artist in the pictures. And so then, well, what if it's telling us from a first personal space? Well, almost all narrative is in one way or another. Okay, here's the challenge. Did Sam hear anything Jordan just said or process it? Does he listen?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways in which our, what's called folk psychological sense of what our minds do is just completely broken, right? I mean, we have
So everything Jordan just laid out there, he's just that we see meaning. We see the meaning of the cliff before we have a conceptualization of the cliff. You can't ask that 7-month-old, please define cliffness for me. No, it doesn't happen. Oh, this is that folk psychological stuff. It's That's not really real. What's real is like the empty blank space of not being worried about a dirty diaper or a hungry belly or the tiger that might eat the meditator or the vomiting I'm going to do with my ayahuasca. So what's real? Well, kind of sounds like someone who's got all their bills paid and has a comfortable place to live. Still don't know why you're faithful to your wife or a good father to your children, but I think that's a good thing. Your system doesn't really account for it very well. Oh, there's greater happiness in doing that. Oh, you mean the package that includes suffering? I think Jordan's package is better than yours.
But we have a sense of the tools we're using to do anything, beliefs, desires, perceptions, expectations.
He doesn't, I mean, this was my frustration with those talks with Jordan before, because Jordan actually listens to him and begins to set up a structure. Again, it's like playing with blocks. And Jordan puts a few pieces together and says, Sam, you want to play? You want to build something with me? That's what a conversation is. We build things together. Dialogos. We both discover things that we both come out of the conversations with things that we didn't come in with. Together we can build something. And so Jordan just set up this little piece and is like, Sam. And Sam's like the toddler that either kicks it over or wanders to another place in the nursery. So then Jordan follows him. And Sam, shall we set this up? No. So then Vanderclay, and I ask myself this, why bother making this video? And I get that, I will get that comment reliably in this video from some of you. Why bother talking about Sam Harris? Why is it meaningful to me? It's meaningful because, and I think this is the same reason for Peterson, even though our missions are a little different. Sam has a big audience. And in Jordan's case, Sam's wife is listening and working through his app. And a little later in the conversation, they're going to talk about the rosary. Now, again, this is my first take on this conversation. I've only listened to it once. And I really want to go back to the Joe Rogan conversation because there's a section in that was really good about success. And that's really the next section. Doing the Rogan videos isn't quite as much fun because I can't, I looked at it a little bit and I sit there and I'm looking at a blank screen because I can't play the Rogan video because of freaking Spotify. But yeah, it's 20 after 5. I should wrap this up. I should post this. Should get home to my lovely wife, have some dinner, maybe go for a walk. Do something meaningful, something that'll probably involve a little bit of suffering too. So some people ask me on Twitter, is this worth watching? Because Sam Harris doesn't listen, it's not a great conversation. Again, and point after point, I had a vision of heaven. I had a dream of heaven. Oh, sure. Well, what about the fact that and this seems to be fairly agreed upon science, that we see meaning much more than objects. Well, people think, blah, 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 blah. Listen, Sam. Have a conversation. So we'll see if I follow this up. I like that section on success far more. In the Rogan knows how to have a conversation. Sam Harris, not convinced.